Hi, everybody. I am Vanessa Rose. I'm the executive director of the American Composers Forum. I'm very excited about this new resource, this digital initiative that we've launched, Anatomy of a Commission. It was developed over several years with many people contributing to it, and it has been increasingly seen as a great need for composers and their collaborators to better understand the process of commissioning and all the conversations we hope will take place before, during, and after that exchange. And I'm very excited to be working with Ari Solotoff, the entertainment lawyer from Solotoff Law, who I'll be introducing in a moment. I've known Ari for many years. We were both orchestra managers and met through the League of American Orchestras, have a lot of friends in common, and have over the years really benefited from the thought leadership, the inquiry, the passion that we both have for this field. And increasingly, as Ari has now become a lawyer and worked with artists, particularly composers and other artists, he's been such a great resource for me as I understand more from the legal perspective of copyright and many other different aspects of what it is to be an artist today. I've just so appreciated the conversations we've had, and now being able to work directly with Ari on this project with our colleagues here at ACF and our partners has been really helpful. And I think will be helpful to you too, as you now will hear from Ari and look at the first resource that we are launching as part of Anatomy of a Commission, this discussion guide that we hope is helpful again to everybody involved in any kind of commissioning project. And importantly, hope that it can encourage more conversation, more agency, and more information, and hopefully more commissions. So I'm very pleased to introduce Ari Solotoff.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, for that really wonderful and warm introduction. I could not be more excited to be a part of this project with the American Composers Forum and with you and your team, who are really championing what it means to be a composer today in this ever-evolving world of new works, new audiences, new venues, and even sort of new ways of envisioning the ways in which projects like this can come to life. So I'm especially excited to share this discussion guide, which we have termed really a working document. It is a living, breathing document because it will be heavily influenced by the many, many different stakeholders who have been a part of this process and who will be a part of the process of digging into the anatomy of a commission. I am thrilled to be part of this. I'm an entertainment lawyer, as you mentioned, and I do a lot of work with composers, with music publishers, with commissioning ensembles, both here in the United States and also in other countries around the world. And I love seeing the diversity of interest and conversation that takes place. And also just, the fun and excitement that can emerge when a new project is given space to come to the concert stage. And so I'm especially excited to share this first resource with the forum and with everybody who has been engaged with the forum, so that we can start to kind of peel away those layers, as it were, and see where there might be some new opportunities for discussion, new value, and maybe even some innovation, the kind of R&D engine, as it were. How do we build that into this process, which I think might also help unlock some new avenues of engaging with audiences and communities in all of the different types of ensembles that commission new works around the world. So this is really exciting. I feel like this is the sort of like the debut of a new work, as it were, and it comes with all of that kind of like trepidation that I imagine a composer feels when their work sort of suddenly makes its way out into the public and is open for enjoyment and accessibility and also scrutiny. And I think in some ways, we're hoping that by unearthing kind of the various elements of the discussion guide, that we might actually open up the discussion in a way that those conversations can happen ahead of the world premiere, and maybe even sort of rebalance some of that energy and emotion in different ways, and maybe even not just before the premiere, but also during, and then what happens after. You sort of articulated it as well in your introductory remarks. So my perspective here is influenced by the work that I do with our clients, by watching what's been happening in the field, by doing a lot of thinking about where are there some opportunities, and also because I have some visibility on what happens in the entertainment space, the sort of broader entertainment arena that we all sit within as culture consumers. How might that inform? What are the things that we can take from the broader entertainment field that might actually be illuminative or helpful to the process? And then what are the things that we might either leave behind or really bolster within the traditions and opportunities of producing these kinds of works in a concert, mission-based environment. I teach at the University of Michigan. I teach at the Eastman School of Music. I teach at Indiana University. It's one of the things that I love. And in some ways, a lot of the materials that we're going to go through are informed by the kinds of conversations that I have in the classroom with students who are really imagining and wondering, like, where do I fit in as a future composer, a future publisher, a future performer? How might my voice make its way into this process that has been so understood, but also yet ripe for opportunity and change? And I think there's an equal sense of, how can I positively influence change in the organizations that I move into as a future leader? And so we're hoping through this process to try to unlock some of those conversations really at every level of the organization. So that's the perspective and the background that I bring to this process. And I definitely stand on, the shoulders of those who came before. There are many excellent attorneys who have advised the forum and provided excellent resources, which are still available on the forum's website, and they have absolutely informed, as have many others in the music publishing community, what it means for a process like this to take shape. So this is very much, I view it as supplemental to and not a replacement of, the things that have necessarily come before. So that's my background. At the 30,000 foot level, when the team and I at the forum started to imagine how a document like this might take shape, I offered a view around what we might call the 5 stages of developing a new work. And I thought it might be useful as a way into this discussion to think about how we might articulate those stages, because I think that having some common language might actually help the overall process for locating where you as a commissioner or composer or music publishing representative are in this process. And in doing so, we can actually sort of focus on the things that matter at that particular stage. So for example, I think about this as sort of 5 different stages. Stage 1, we might call just, again, to borrow a Hollywood term, the development stage. What is that initial period of time when kind of ideas are percolating? There might be some preliminary discussions around parties, a composer and an ensemble coming together in order to imagine and consider a new work. And it can come from any direction, right? The composer may have an idea that they've been thinking about for some time that they really want to pitch. An artistic administrator or a conductor or music director or any other organizational leader may say, I really want to work with so-and-so. How can we start a conversation with them? I think that is the most sort of interesting, formative stage of a work, because anything's possible at that moment in time. And there really are no barriers other than, just sort of saying, let's just have a conversation. And I think acknowledging that those conversations can occur in a very supportive and safe environment without anybody or everyone having to necessarily commit at that stage, right, allows for lots of incubation to occur as a result. So I think the more of those kinds of sort of early stage conversations, the sort of more diverse and the more diverse and also the more opportunities that will sort of make their way downstream. So like we should always be in development conversations is sort of my thinking and theory here. So let's imagine that those development conversations are moving forward, and it's there may be actually something here. How do we bring some additional definition to that? And so the question, and as we'll see in the discussion guide, there's a space in this conversation for a composer and an organization or commissioner to come together just around development. Like, can we work together to ask you, composer, to write something? It could be just a description of your imaginative idea for the project that we could take, to our donors, to our organizational team, to others in order to see if we can develop some interest in this further. And that might come together just as a very basic, what we would call like development deal, let's just work on that, and maybe we'll provide some compensation for you composer to participate in that process as we work to help kind of develop greater interest in your idea. So I think, there's a lot of, that activity that can kind of happen in the early stage. And let's say it starts to gain some momentum. Well, then we're sort of heading to the second stage. Now we actually have to start to put something on paper. And that's really where a document like this might come in, the discussion guide or deal memo, to say, okay, how do we start to align around some of the kind of more important terms without necessarily binding each other to that process? But we need to have a vehicle for discussion so that we can put those basic terms on paper in a shared way. And I think a lot of this happens very naturally. I've seen many, many, many emails that are kind of, here are the bullet points, the kind of the key, elements of a commission. And it's like, great. How do we take that and go one step further? And so we'll go into what some of those additional deal points or discussion points might be. And then let's say the parties have really, composer and commissioner have come together and say, yep, we're committed to this project. Let's contract around it. Now the composer really can move into the preparation and delivery stage. I'm actually working on the piece. I've committed time to it. Publishing representatives are on board. There's a sense of when the delivery might occur that's been factored into the broader timelines for, the composer's work and life, and all that has been kind of made known in the process. Once that's sort of, all the way through, we get to the premiere stage, right? Okay, now the work is actually going to get performed. What are all the events and activities, and how do we best support that? How do we best market it and promote it and credit the composer and do all the things that are going to make the most out of all the investment that has been made by both commissioner and composer, in this process. So certainly maximizing, that value and opportunity of the premiere. And then let's not forget the kind of post-premiere stage. Essentially, like, the work has been performed, it's made its premiere. Are there either additional plans for recording or for touring or subsequent performances, subsequent regional premieres, maybe even a sort of commitment to subsequent rentals on a different part of the season? What's going to be the life of this work, and how do we best support that? And again, all these conversations have been happening all along. I just think that we're, taking a step further and saying, how do we, bring some definition and structure around that as part of the life cycle of a new work? And I like the idea of both the life cycle of a work and also kind of the ecosystem or the sort of the broader environment that it sits within, because works come from our real life, composer lived experience in response to the world in which composers live, and the response to the world in which, arts organizations and their communities are considering and trying to make sense of. And I think that's where a new work can be a really powerful engine for conversation and engagement beyond the kind of reinterpretation of existing works in the catalog. So that's what excites us about this project. And we will go into detail about the various elements, but having that frame for the sort of 5 stages of the process, hopefully will allow everyone to say, okay, we're really in the development period here. Let's focus on that. And so that's it.
Yeah. Yeah, what I so appreciate about your outline, and I think one of the goals of this project is that you talk a lot about conversation. And yes, these conversations are happening, but not necessarily inclusive of all of these different phases, particularly that developmental process. As we've learned, sometimes that is kind of rushed or maybe sometimes even overlooked in some cases. And also thinking about what happens beyond the premiere. We want to really encourage those conversations too, and recognizing the nuance of the conversation, that this isn't a one size fits all. Every artist is different, every organization is different, every setting is different. This is why we're thinking about the discussion guide, right, as points that are going to be optional, maybe depending on where you're entering, as you described, it's going to be different for you, but hopefully again, just encourage that collaborative communication on both sides. So thank you. I'm really excited to dive into this.
So not surprisingly, the initial questions around our discussion guide are focused on the who's coming together to make this project come to life and to support its growth and development. And certainly the composer and any of the commissioning parties, we want to try to understand and try to be clear about like who is taking the lead, particularly from a commissioning perspective. Is anybody taking the lead, or is it the thinking that the composer is taking the lead in helping to steward the growth and development and funding of this particular work? So just being clear, I think at the beginning of who's involved is a really important first step. And then certainly for the composer, for identifying and having a sense of who their performance rights organization affiliation might be, whether that's ASCAP or BMI, because it could quite be that in this process, representatives from ASCAP or BMI may be of assistance in thinking through various elements, not the least of which is just making sure that the performance actually gets reported once it's premiered, to ASCAP and BMI, so that the composer and publisher can earn those royalties. So identifying and having a sense of, is this composer represented by a publisher, or are they not? Are they self-represented? And just taking stock of that fact. Are there other representatives? It could be an accountant, it could be a lawyer. Understanding who the composer works with and who's on their team is certainly going to be part of helping to steward this process from beginning to end. So I think just making note of that, inquiring about it, being comfortable if you are a self-published composer, disclosing that fact, and noting that you're a self-published composer, and this is how you handle your publishing and your copyrights on your own or with others who are on your team. And so that's really the first step. And then often projects may come together because of an affiliation or a connection to an artist. There may be an ensemble, there may be a guest artist, a conductor, somebody else involved in the process who's helping to champion the work. And we might even say, is this person attached to the project in the future, right? If a concerto is being written or a work featuring a specific artist, we may want to make note of that fact because that artist is certainly central to its development and premiere, and may even be involved in the development of the work if they're going to be participating in workshops or whatnot. So again, unearthing those terms and sort of saying what are going to be those points of intersection with those other artists, conductors, ensembles who may be involved in the project and who may be participating creatively or even just from a visioning perspective. So I think that's just kind of setting the stage of the who. And then we start to get into a little bit of the what. And I think, beyond what we often think of as the kind of basic elements of, commissioning a new work, which, we're all accustomed to. How long is the work going to be? Maybe what else is going to be featured on the program? Is there a certain instrumentation for which the work is being written for? Can we pause? And I think this is where a lot of my conversations with colleagues and composers sort of, I feel like they're the conversations that happen in like the parking lot, but don't make their way into the actual process. Is, what are the circumstances that are giving rise to the development of this new work? Was there something, of a historic nature or community nature or news nature, or an event in the community that is being celebrated or memorialized or honored? Is there something that, a particular individual in the community for whom, this work is being written in support of? How do we bring some of that conversation, into the process? If I were writing the agreement that went along with this, I might even put some of that information into, the preamble or kind of the working context of the document to say, let's use this as a touchstone in the commissioning process for why this work is taking shape. And I think that lends itself into a greater discussion around, to what degree is this work being written or not written in support of particular social impact goals? How can we, bring and elevate that part of the discussion into the commissioning process, and to say, what are the motivations and objectives for this work fulfilling a social impact or social justice priority for the organization? And aside from just the creation and delivery of the work, how are we going to, how are the organizations and the composer partners and publishers going to honor that, throughout the process, not just in the contracting process and not just in the delivery and premiere, but are there going to be other points of intersection along the way when those social justice or other goals can be really elevated and valued and considered as part of the process, and not necessarily assumed either from the composer's time or other perspectives where it might fit in. Now, of course, this is an optional consideration, not at all required, but maybe a benefit to the overall process. One of the things that we're hoping to promote in the course of the Anatomy of a Commission project, similarly, and I think this is where there's a lot of opportunity for innovation, when a work might incorporate underlying rights from a text, from a poem, from somebody, a third party right that from which the work is being adapted or developed. How do we, again, put that on the table on the front end of the process to say, how are we going to work together to acquire the textual rights, poetry rights, adaptation rights, story making rights? This is where Hollywood, I think, is really forward thinking and saying there are lots and lots of amazing stories to be told and shared and developed. How can we bring some of those stories and material into the concert environment in a way that allows for the rights holder to be recognized and compensated, but also allows the composer to feel like they're not sort of the victim of copyright and can actually engage in an innovative process? And the commissioner as well, right? There may be something in the community or someone in the community with whom the organization and the composer all want to collaborate with. This is the space to really have that conversation. And maybe it's dramatic, maybe it's non-dramatic. This discussion guide was written primarily for a non-dramatic context. In other words, not for opera or not for staging, but that's not to say that it couldn't be developed, for those uses as well. So I think this is where there's a lot of hidden and unlocked opportunity for the, concert performing arts world to embrace the engagement with third-party underlying rights as a means of developing new works for the concert stage. And I hope it takes shape as part of this process. The next part of the discussion guide, we talk about development materials and a development fee. And again, optional, but I'm seeing a trend where composers and artists are being asked to create materials that might help to outline, what is the initial concept for the project or the work. It's not, I think, unusual for a commissioner to ask a composer, can you write 2 to 3 sentences that gives us a description of like what you're imagining that you're going to compose? So can we take that a step further and say, like, not only should that be articulated and made a part of the process, but maybe it's something that is worth investing in, right? It's a lot, a lower threshold for a commissioner to commit some upfront development money to a composer to envision what that work might be, than to commit, a full thousands and thousands of dollars to the commissioning of a new work when it may or may not be ripe yet for further for further development and for premiere. So I think, can we create this space in the process for, a composer to be compensated for some of that early activity in imagining and envisioning a new work, and especially where, the commissioning organization, if they're bringing in partners, needs some of those materials to kind of create and create interest in the project. And I think this is definitely the kind of space and also the kind of document, as we note in the footnotes to the document, where a separate deal memo or a separate even just letter of memorandum of understanding or even just letter agreement could be shaped just around the creation of those development materials as a sort of lead into the broader deal memo or the broader commissioning agreement. So I can imagine a scenario where a commissioning organization may have multiple development agreements or development letters out with composers, sort of like, like a donor pyramid in a sense, where you may have sort of 40 of those out, but only 20 of them might actually make their way into the commissioning process. So to me, this is, I think, a really exciting opportunity to build upon within the Anatomy of a Commission project. From there, I think that starts to naturally take composer and commissioner into the conversation in, I think, a very thoughtful and generative way around, okay, you had this idea for, a 30-minute work that's going to include, all of these elements. How are we going to pay for that? And so, having that conversation kind of earlier on in the process, including who's bringing what funding to the to the project, who might be involved as the co-commissioner or collaborator, joint venture in the production of this new work. Again, I think slowing down and having those conversations, earlier on, and maybe even further out, right? 3, 4, or 5 years out, I think could lend itself to these types of works, taking shape both more frequently and a more sort of diverse and equitable basis. So it's, I think, the circumstances where, a commissioning organization comes to composer X and says, this is what we need from you in 6 months, that starts to feel, inequitable. And so how do we potentially minimize some of those circumstances unless it's absolutely necessary and desired, and it's a good fit for both parties. From there, we're able to kind of go into, the basics and the common, themes of instrumentation, duration, right? Now that you have a sense of what the work is going to look like, now we can fill in some of those greater details around, what will be needed from an operational and string, instrumentation, woodwind, brass, et cetera, or any other elements that, composer and a commissioning organization hope to filter into the project. And so now we're starting to see some of that greater definition. And I guess it's probably a good point in time to say, this may be the initial theory of the work. This deal memo could be drafted based on those terms. It could change, right? And if it changes in the future, everybody would come together and amend the deal memo and move on accordingly. So it's not intended to be, concrete in the sense of everybody needs some working theories to be able to plan around, and then, based on that, eventually contract around, the actual binding terms. So, that's takes us really through, the kind of basics of how, the conversation might take shape. What excites me about the process and the concept of the Anatomy of a Commission is that it's an invitation for composer and commissioner to engage in dialogue and discussion, and really just additional questions about the process. In other words, how can we use the commissioning process as a method of learning more about each composer and commissioner's goals and objectives, and not as a means of how quickly can we get to a contract, but really more how can we use the process as a way of discovery and a way of engagement with each other's goals and objectives. And so specifically, that might mean a composer saying, share more. I'm curious about, how the work fits into the season, how the work fits into the program. being and feeling empowered to, ask those questions as part of the composer's own due diligence, but also as part of how, the composer will take all this into account when actually sitting down to, compose and work on the material. And I think vice versa, commissioner feeling comfortable, asking about and learning about a composer's particular experience, past experiences, or methods of composing, particularly on topics that might be, more challenging or more thematic, or even, around a particular topic. And so I think just learning about each other's experience and expectations is the goal for, for the process. Yeah, so in terms of granting or obtaining permissions, in the early stages of a composer's project, it usually falls on the composer to, go out and at least have those initial conversations about acquiring the necessary rights for the development of a new work that incorporates underlying rights. Now, that very well could shift. If there really is interest in a project, the commissioning organization slash producer, as it were, may actually, participate in assisting in acquiring those rights, because ultimately it's to the benefit of the producer commissioning organization to know that all the rights have been cleared and permissions obtained in producing the work. That said, composer, may choose to lead that process because they're the ones who are going to walk away with the copyright in the resulting work, and that means they need to have secured the permissions and licenses necessary so that the work really stands as a whole and could be licensed and rented to others. So some of that could actually work out, as part of the process based on the degree to which the commissioning organization wants to be involved in future productions, or do they just want to be involved in the initial production and, everything else, flows with the composer. One point of the Animated Commission project that we are excited to introduce is this focus on workshopping and readings and creating more space between the commission of a work and its actual premiere. And so, this is not for everyone. It's definitely optional. Some works don't need this. Some composers would be horrified by the concept of, adding in, public or, other experimental elements to the process. But at the same time, I definitely have seen works that would benefit, both on the commissioner's side, or do benefit on the commissioner's side and composers and publishers' side, from just creating some liminal space for, materials to just kind of take shape, be tried out, experimented with, that a composer would, I think, extremely value, and the commissioner, in terms of seeing a work take shape. And of course, there are many organizations, who have these kind of wet ink type series that allow for sort of visibility on the process of commissioning. I don't think that's anything new or innovative. All we're, suggesting or thinking about in the discussion guide is how do we bring that into the actual sort of operational elements of the process, and saying, there may be benefits here in creating these kind of touch points for, the work being created to have some readings and workshop time, both, to benefit the composer and to benefit the commissioner. It might be a great opportunity for donors to come in, as we've seen. It may be a great opportunity for the composer to get feedback. So, not necessarily just assuming that the work needs to go from, commission to premiere, but that there can actually be some space in between. So that was really the idea behind this optional, language. And then how does that get compensated for? And what are going to be some of the rights that a composer or commissioner might walk away with as part of that workshopping stage? This is a common part of the theatrical development world. Is this something that we could incorporate within the concert world as well? Another element that I think, we focus on, or I've seen focus on in my practice, is, not just the performance of the premiere, but the rehearsal stage. And, how is that process being thought about, with the conductor and the ensemble, the amount of time allotted to work on the program, and to work on the work, the new commission, to the extent that, it fits in. And I would sort of step back and say, on an organizational, space, as an attorney, I'm thinking about, if I were negotiating for my client as a composer, I want to ensure that they're going to have the best possible premiere of their work. And to me, that means giving them the most amount of rehearsal time, for that work to have the best possible performance. And I think to me, that's kind of the balance of the question here is how do we continue to create those circumstances, whether by contract or by expectation, is it a point of discussion ahead of time, certainly relative to other works on the program, that the piece is being premiered around. So I think there's space in the conversation again for that to occur optionally by everybody involved. The not surprising elements, when is the premiere going to take place? And where is it going to take place? Kind of just those logistical elements, and having that thought through in terms of not just the world premiere, but will there be subsequent performances, regional premieres? Because from the composer's perspective, those regional premieres, either as a co-commissioning element or otherwise, are opportunities for more value to be derived from all the time and energy that has gone into the creation of this work. And so leaving some space in the conversation for that to occur as well. I think a lot of questions I see are around payment terms and fees. Not surprisingly, I'm not going to give specific prescriptive information here, but just to say that this is a point of diligence for every composer and publisher and commissioner to dig further into. Is this around the compensation for the amount of minutes composed, the size of the work, the delivery timeline? All of those elements could in fact be factors in deciding upon the fee. And so there's not necessarily a one size fits all, but definitely each one of these is a point of discussion for the composer and his or her representatives, in working with the commissioning party. Very much related to the fee question is the costs of preparation of the parts, and who's going to bear those costs. And so just not losing sight of the fact that it's not just about creating the manuscript or the work, but also how are you going to, how are the parties going to make sure that parts are made, printed, engraved, and delivered in a timeline that either meets everybody's objectives or otherwise. And so for commissioners to be aware of the fact that this is a real cost to the composer, to have their parts printed, particularly if they're a self-published composer, it's not necessarily turnkey, and it is a costly part of the process. So this may be an area that a commissioning ensemble, particularly if they have the in-house capabilities to print and produce these parts, could actually participate in the process that way. And simply because the composer delivers the materials by PDF does not necessarily at all mean that they've relinquished copyright. And so I think that kind of creating that distinction between copyright and distribution of the parts are really separate issues to be discussed. So timelines are a big part of the process, I think, and especially if there are going to be other elements built in, like development materials or workshop materials. For everybody to try to articulate some tentative, timelines that could be incorporated into the deal memo, I think would be helpful for managing and setting expectations. And those could be, adjusted by mutual agreement, but, having some theory, of what those timelines might be is, I think, an important part of the process. Interestingly, and I think I would just point out, as a copyright attorney, I'm often focused on the question of when the performance materials, have the parts, right, have actually been delivered, and the score has actually been delivered, to the commissioning ensemble, because that triggers a data publication from a copyright perspective. So once the score has been delivered, that's a date to pay attention to, because for a composer to register their copyright within 3 months of publication, there are some additional benefits, from a statutory perspective to following that process. So just making note of that. And, if you are a self-published composer, paying attention to the data publication or data delivery of the score is something to be mindful of in your kind of overall catalog. But more generally, obviously, this is going to be driven by the the timelines and demands of the commissioning organization and ensemble. And so having some sense of how these pieces are going to fit together, this is the space in which to do that. And it changes. It, as we know, there can be many circumstances. And I think the what I'm often advising composers of is just to be upfront and to be, transparent about what's taking place so that everybody can make adjustments as necessary. Well, I think not surprisingly, changes are like inevitable. And so the question becomes not only just sort of encouraging communication about it, but yeah, having something in writing that specifies, what everybody's agreed to, and that it's amending, either the delivery requirements or the premiere dates, just sort of, being clear about what portions of the agreement are being adjusted as a result of changed circumstances. So I think that that's not only par for the course, but I think appropriate for everybody to document in writing. Well, I think when I'm looking at an agreement for a composer or a publisher for that matter, I'm thinking about, how the compensation terms are not only negotiated, but also what are the payment timelines. And we pay very close attention to what triggers what payment and when. And so knowing commissioner and composer that those are negotiable points, is there a payment triggered on the signing of the agreement? How much? By how many days will the payment be received once the agreement is signed? Is there a payment triggered by the delivery of the manuscript, even if it hasn't been transitioned or turned into parts yet? Or is another payment triggered by delivery of the score and parts? And then how long after delivery of the score and parts, number of days or number of weeks, will payment be delivered? All of those are points that can be incorporated into a deal memo or commissioning agreement. So yeah, as with everything, it's negotiable. The point is just to try to be upfront and clear about what the expectations and needs are, and especially if a composer, a self-published composer, is relying on receipt of payment to pay a third party for parts production, you may want to specify that in the agreement. Another part of our discussion guide that I think is particularly interesting and important is for composer and commissioner to be keying into the grant of rights, because that's really kind of that's the core of where this all comes down to, what rights are being granted. And more often than not, what's being granted is essentially a contract right, essentially who gets to present the world premiere performance or performances of this particular work at the exclusion contractually, right, of everybody else. And so that is dictated by contract, and then who may be able to present or premiere subsequent performances, regional performances, and then for how long might this exclusivity period operate if a particular ensemble has exclusivity for a work over a certain amount of time. What is the length of that exclusivity period, and why might an ensemble want exclusivity? Well, it may be because they want to take the work on tour, and they want to be the only ones who perform it, or they want the opportunity to record the work commercially. So there are a number of reasons why exclusivity may be beneficial, and the question is sort of how is that, of course, factored into some of the other compensation terms. So the grant of rights section, becomes a very important part of the agreement, and that's functionally what gives the organization the value at the end of the day. What I often see and could see here is not only a grant of rights regarding the initial performance, but even if the commissioning ensemble is going to have the right to perform the work in subsequent years without having to pay a separate rental fee, that could be negotiated in here as well, which would be beneficial to the composer, because it means that they're sort of guaranteeing a certain number of additional performances. So it could work both ways. So that's just like the performance right and the right of being able to exclude others from having that right in the future. But then you get into the media rights, which are really adjacent to the performance right. And that's where we start to see, a couple different categories that we've tried to articulate here. The first is just the most basic audio recording rights. Does the commissioning ensemble have the right to capture the recording for archival purposes in an audio format? Can they use that for an AM/FM radio broadcast, locally? Could they even stream it on their website, through through a webcast or through the radio station's website if they have webcasting ability? So those would be some of the provisions that might be negotiated just for basic audio rights. Then you get into, okay, separate from that, we might look at, well, who has the right to commercially release that first recording of the work? And this becomes really important because for copyright purposes, the composer gets to decide who has the first commercial recording right. It's actually a right under copyright, or a provision under copyright that a composer can decide, because once under Section 115, a work has been commercially recorded and released for the first time, anybody else can secure a mechanical license to record that work without having to necessarily obtain the composer's permission if they get a statutory license. So knowing who's going to give that first commercial recording is really important for purposes of who can record this work in the future. Separate, and again, apart from the audio recording rights, would be the audiovisual recording rights. In other words, the synchronization rights. So who has the ability to take a video capture of the performance and to put it up, for example, on YouTube or any other, audiovisual streaming service or mechanism. And so that would typically, we might see that contracted differently than just the audio rights. So we're hoping through the discussion guide just to be deliberate about saying, that audio rights are different from audiovisual rights, and let's just create a mechanism for that discussion to occur, including whether any of that material will be made available back to the composer for the composer's own promotional use, right? Because the composer may want to be able to feature these performances on their own website or in their own promotional materials, and obviously, subject to the terms of local collective bargaining agreements, composers are going to get, different responses as to how much material from the performance they can actually use for their own promotional purposes. So again, mostly just encouraging, discussion to occur around what the limitations are and what the types of media uses, audiovisual, would be available to a composer based on how the work is being digitized. So obviously, this could be a big part of the conversation, and just not just premiering and delivering the work, but in the afterlife of the work, how will other parties be able to hear the work if they want to rent it or perform it in the future? The digital uses actually become really quite important. So making some space for an audio perusal mechanism, through a password protected or some other website through which a composer could showcase their work, that's something that I'm hopeful might be encouraged as part of this anatomy of a commission process. Aside from that, I think we go into in the discussion guide, what we might consider to be the kind of ancillary wraparound activities. Once a composer and commissioner have committed to a project, how do you continue to enliven and breathe life into it to make it as vibrant a project as it can be in the form of publicity and program notes and all the other elements that a composer's visit to participate in the premiere, educational and any other community events that might take place around a work, and sort of specifying and leaving space for that to occur within the conversation. One area that I've become particularly passionate about in thinking about composer agreements is this question of credit. In broad terms, compensation and credit are quite important to any party who's invested a great deal of time in creating a new work. And so what I'm curious about through this process is, can composers and commissioners give the kinds of credit to the composer in their marketing and promotional activities, so that For example, should the composer's name be listed alongside the other names of the other composers on the program or advertising materials? That credit, particularly for today's living composers, can be quite substantial. And so leaving space for the credit conversation to occur and recognizing from the commissioner's perspective that the provision of credit is really quite important, and I think a really useful tool to encourage equity in the conversation beyond compensation, so that there's a feeling of shared investment in this work. I think nobody wants to sort of be involved in a project where they open up the advertisement for that upcoming program, and the composer who spent all the last 2 years working on this project, their name isn't even featured in the upcoming advertisement. So how can we encourage space for that to occur within the broader crediting conversation? And it is material, not just from a reputational perspective, but also from a legal perspective. So I think that takes us into the kind of what ifs, of a composer and commissioning relationship, the things that we need to plan for, because not every relationship is going to necessarily either end in a premiere or things are going to work out according to plan. And so this is where having discussion ahead of time around what happens if the work isn't delivered, is a portion of the fee refundable or non-refundable, what happens if timelines need to be amended, how do we address those kinds of conversations ahead of time within the discussion, is something that we wanted to encourage in the Anatomy of a Commission discussion guide as well. Yeah, there are a number of considerations that composer and commissioner can factor in when thinking about recording digital media rights in reference to the premiere, or really any rental, perhaps, performance of a composer's work, right? So I think the first big distinction is just to recognize that there's a difference between an audio capture and an audio visual capture. And often those get collapsed. And I think for composers and commissioners to be very clear and precise about what type of a capture recording is being made. Is it just audio only, or is it audio visual as well? That's kind of step one, it seems to me. Beyond that, then the question becomes, what can you do with that capture and recording? Can composer obtain a copy of the audio recording? If so, under what limitations on use, which are often dictated by the collective bargaining terms or electronic media terms of the commissioning ensemble. So the composer needs to definitely engage with the commissioner around what limitations would I face if I were to ask for an audio recording of the performance or even rehearsals of this material. What can I do with it? What can't I do with it? So I think from the composer's perspective, having a sense of what questions would arise and what the limitations would be. And then the same thing from the commissioner's perspective, being clear and careful about, if you're going to capture these materials, are they going to be held just for archival purposes? Are they going to be used in connection with grant making activities? So are they going to be, submitted as part of grant applications? And will the composer have an opportunity to weigh in on which performance or edited performance is going to be used as part of the grant application? And then beyond that, is it going to be used audio for broadcast, audio for website streaming? So each one of these is a different use that would require discussion. So just like you would, be paying attention to the details of, what instruments are going to appear on stage in connection with the performance, needing to give the same level of attention and detail to the digital media uses that are being, requested and made of the audio and audiovisual uses for a particular work. And if it's audiovisual, that then takes it, the composer into the land of synchronization and having a sense of what synchronized uses are going to be made, either on digital, social media, or something potentially, more broad than that, and vice versa, the degree to which the composer would have those reciprocal, promotional use rights. So I think this is it's a really important part of the agreement, and just being upfront about, what limitations, might exist would be a big part of how to approach the conversation. I'm so hopeful about the use of this discussion guide, and I know that I and the American Composers Forum would be delighted to receive feedback and comments about how you are using it, what some of the questions are that are arising as you're trying to navigate some of these terms, and in particular, how we can continue to evolve this piece for future use. And I would also offer, just as it's mentioned in the discussion guide, none of today's conversation or any of these materials are intended to be a substitute for good professional legal advice that you, as commissioner or composer, should obtain independently of this webinar. I would absolutely encourage you to reach out to a local professional to assist you in navigating these elements and putting it together in a way that's reflective of your individual circumstances. And aside from that, just want to thank the American Composers Forum, Vanessa Rose, Carolina Heredia, and the entire team at ACF for helping to steward this production and this project, Anatomy of a Commission, going forward.